So I guess I'll start out and just say this is Growing Up Aspen, Adventures of the Unsupervised with Chris Pomeroy. And today we've got Dean Jackson. So there's three of us. And we're with Moore, the guy who put on so many plays around Aspen that it's a thrill to get him on this group chat. You know what I felt was really interesting was you had you got into the high school at a young age as a teacher.
Yeah.
And so there was a difference between students and teachers, and you sort of stepped between, and so there was sort of a connection with you that was more of a friend and a teacher. But you had an interesting experience with a lot of students. You know what I mean? It felt like not only that, but drama is one of those things where you're talking and who you are and your personality and dealing with people. Whereas in math class, it's just math, and Sanchez is just dealing with algebraic equations. And so there isn't as much connection in that sense. Whereas with acting on stage, you do have that. And so it seems like you had a very interesting perspective of the Aspen High School, and you've been there for so long. Can you talk a little bit about the differences that you've seen from when you started Aspen High to the students that are there now? I mean, there's some similarities and some differences. Can you speak to some of that?
Well, you're right. I mean, I was younger than most of the teachers, and I had a history since I had been there. And in those days, I was the only one that was on, that everybody referred to by his first name. I was Brad.
Right.
And everybody else was Mr. or Mrs. or, whatever.
Yeah.
But the theater has this amazing way of building family. We in the theater, we're incorporating every aspect of the arts. There's visual, there's auditory, there's and it's all there. It really is the truest representation of civilization and humanity wrapped up into one, because even though film might be considered similar or television, the theater has a live audience, so the audience is as much a part of that experience as the cast, and we're all in there really just creating together. People say to me all the time, well, gosh, the book was better than the film.
Right.
Well, why is that? It's because the book, we're using our own imaginations to try and understand what's going on, right?
Right.
The film is somebody else's interpretation,
yeah.
Right? And theater does that for all of us. We're working as this collaborative, imagining this together, and we say, okay, so this wooden cube over here, that's actually a chair. And the audience says, okay.
Right.
And we go on, and they get to imagine that is this upholstered chair or whatever.
Right.
So yeah, that was really, really important. And when you talk about the differences of the students and all of that, I mean, because I was there for a while, and then I left, and I moved to LA and worked for a huge theater company in LA for about 10 years, and then I came back and after a while got back involved with the school again. But what's really interesting is just Aspen has always been this really sort of bizarre place to grow up.
Yeah.
I remember telling my mom at one point that I really wanted to go to school because I wanted to go and find out what the real world was like. And my mom says, well, this is the real world for me. And I said, well, yeah, I get that. And I can't imagine growing up anywhere but Aspen. But I was the first one to tell the students, get out of town, leave town for a while. You need to go and experience things outside of this valley so that you understand why your parents chose to raise you here.
Right. Right.
Sadly, of my closest friends in my graduating class, the ones who, with very few exceptions, the ones who did not leave town are no longer here to tell us about that. I lost my dearest friends to,
Thanks. Yeah.
overdoses or suicide or, anyway, just,
Yeah.
So it's an interesting place because there's so much to do in Aspen and yet so little to do in a healthy perspective when you're of a certain age.
Right. It's also there's also that thing about living in Aspen is sort of a magical place. And when everything changes so much, and then you go out into the world and you see how different it is, it all of a sudden either it charges you up to get up and go do stuff, or else it kind of sinks you down and you realize you wish you could go back, and then you try to go back and you can't go back. So you're kind of in that struggle, and then that takes you down too. So there's this whole thing about having something so great and have experienced it that some kids feel like they might not be able to go back, and so it becomes kind of an issue. So I sort of, from a very young age, I've sort of seen that, where Aspen was so, you were dancing in a flame just living there, and when you go out in the real world and you see how rough and tough the real world is, sometimes it's hard to go back. It's like season passes aren't $150 anymore. It's interesting because the topic you bring up is such an interesting thing that Aspen kids have to go through. I mean, all kids go through it growing up, but it's one of those, as you grow older, trying to see the life that you've grew up with and the life that you might have, and trying to see how those align. It's sort of an interesting dilemma, and I wonder if a lot of Aspen kids are going through that now, because a lot of people I know, their parents live in employee housing, whereas back in my day, their parents actually owned homes, and they actually lived in a lot of the homes that were in Aspen. When you get down to the east end or the west end of town, most of those homes were kids that we knew. Now it's the owner of Target, it's the owner of Walmart, you know what I mean? It's not, and their kids aren't going to school there, you know what I mean? So it's kind of an interesting juxtaposition of what's going on, and I wonder what it's like with the kids now there.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I haven't had a lot of connections with the students now, although some have been. I mean, I'm on the community theater board still after all these years.
Yeah.
Current president of the board, which I did back in those days too. But so we have students who are involved with shows and things like that. But what's interesting is that because the exposure that I got, I mean, I have a wall of photographs over here that are signed by, Debbie Reynolds and Donald O'Connor, and I have a picture of me with George Burns right over here on my shelf. I mean, and those are connections that most of those I made in Los Angeles, but probably as many connections as I made in an amazing sense, and people that I've worked with, those connections have been made in Aspen.
Right.
And my job in LA came from a connection that I had in Aspen. So, there are opportunities that no one would get anywhere else. Right. And I knew that to be true of some of the students now, like a young woman who just graduated last year from the high school. Well, actually, there were a couple of them, and a young man. I got a chance to work with them through the Aspen Fringe Festival. We all had a chance to work with Simon Stevens, who is an amazing playwright from London, and he was in residence. I mean, you don't get those kind of opportunities somewhere else. Right. So that it's almost, in a sense, it's almost feast or famine, isn't it? There's so much that you get from growing up in this amazingly cosmopolitan community.
It's interesting because when I was in high school, when I was working with you in the community theater, on any number of high school shows and a number of things, my day job, my high school job was actually working as an actor in Colorado, like the theater under the Dome. I don't think that many kids get an opportunity like that in a town other than Aspen. I mean, it was That's how I made my hobby shop money.
Yeah. So it's, it really, it is interesting. And I think that the students now are struggling with many of the same issues. I think it may be because Aspen now, I mean, the house that I grew up in, and my family never owned it. We rented it from a family friend for a couple $100 a month forever.
Yeah.
That house just recently sold and was remodeled. And I know the remodeling was $10 million. So I can't imagine what the cost of the property was. I mean, it just.
So I'm going to, let me interject. I want a couple of points that you made, Brad, that were pretty right on. One, I'm terribly sorry to hear that you've had friends that have succumbed to ODs and suicide and things like that.
Yeah.
And not to make light of that or make it any smaller. I have several as well. Not only that, but we have several of classmates, and when I say classmates, I mean 2 years above us and 2 years below us. So basically 4 years of school. And that's a pretty common thing up there. And I hate to say it, but I don't know the numbers, but I'm guessing that it's probably higher than a national average for that type of thing. And I kind of want to correlate it with something else that you said, which is, the access you have to not only famous people, but to people of enormous wealth. And I have to say that it's just a gut feeling for me that those two things are correlated. And I mean, I can tell you from my own perspective that it's been sort of rough going out in the real world and realizing that, hey, despite having access to those folks, I'm still living not fabulously wealthy. We're just kind of all just living life and making it by. You know what I mean? Can you comment on that?
Well, no, I think that's a good point. I know that, and I've heard arguments on both sides of whether number of suicides in this community are higher or lower than the national average, and I've heard both sides of the argument. And maybe it's just that we're a small enough community that we really see that and we know everybody. But I do think that it's a really tough place to be, on so many levels. I mean, for 9 months out of the year, there's only one way in and out of town, and when that's closed, I mean, it just, there's something very trapping about that, and yet something very exciting. The sense of it being such a playground for so many people, and even in the times when I was in school, I mean, there were still, there weren't as many private jets, but there were still people coming into town. I don't think it was as much a flaunting of that wealth. And in those days, there were still hotels. They were just starting to come up with the condominiums, which I think was a problem, because then the condominiums, people don't go to local restaurants because they bring in their own, and now that they're second homes, they bring in their own chef and their own staff or whatever. But I think, it was such a playground that I think it did skew how we look at things. And when I was younger, I mean, I had friends who had multiple cars, and their families were incredibly wealthy. It didn't seem to be flaunted quite as much, but I think that shifting, I think what's tough is that it's a hard lifestyle to maintain if you don't have something that really focuses you. And I think that's what the theater brought for me, and I think for so many people, is that there was a chance of really reaching into our inner selves and finding a family. And I mean, not that saved everybody, but I think that was something that was really important to me, and I think to a lot of people. I mean, I can't speak for you, Dean, but I think that probably helped you through a lot of things.
Yeah, I mean, I speak to it a little bit in the book,
Right.
but I don't know how much you were aware of at the time, but I had a tough home life when I was in high school. And a lot of substance abuse in the house, and I was using too. And theater became a refuge. You know, I've said it before. Chris's mom became my second mom, and in a sense, even though you were, you know, only 10 years older than me, you became an authority figure, a calming influence. You wrote in a letter from college that there was rarely a time that you and I were not working on a show together. And really, the various incarnations of the theater world in Aspen became a refuge for me. And I would hazard guess that it's the same for many others.
Well, you know, it definitely is, and you know, just the different people that I've been able to stay in contact with, and see where their lives have gone, and not everybody's gone on in theater, but they've gone on with a great sense of purpose, and that's not because of a connection with me. I mean, I'm proud to have been a part of that, but I think it's the family that we build with that, and I think that what happens oftentimes is that people don't get a chance to really feel that family. And I think that that's getting more and more difficult to try and maintain that sort of family sense within the small community because, yeah, I mean, you know, as I mentioned, I'm on the Aspen Community Theater Board. One of the big issues that we're tackling right now is how do you become, or how do you maintain your identity as a community theater when most of the people involved with your organization no longer live in that community?
Right.
There are a handful of people that live in Aspen. Everybody else is from Glenwood, or, yeah, I mean, I live in Glenwood now.
Right. Yeah. Well, almost everybody I know lives in Carbondale, Basalt, or Glenwood, not Aspen. And you know, like I say, when I go walk in Carbondale, I feel like I'm walking down Main Street, Aspen, back in our time, as opposed to now when I go there, I see everything's being torn down, and I barely recognize some of the spaces. I mean, you know, Crossroads Drug is still there, only it's, you know, Ralph Lauren, you know, and it's everything, you know, all the mom and pops went out and in went Gucci and whatever. I mean, we saw that with the Hard Rock. It started with Benetton when Tom's Market shut down, you know, so we saw the writing on the wall. We saw where it was going, you know, and I feel like part of that and losing that is part of what loses some of the culture. But I also feel like there's a certain sense of history and respect and honor that folks can have for that, as opposed to the old skis on the wall that people used to have, you know, to show, old time, old past, and all that stuff. The mining, the shaft would have all the mining stuff around, you know, to kind of show the history that way. But it feels to me like our new history needs to be a little more present, not so 40s. You know, it needs to be some of the 60s, some of the 70s, some of the 80s, some of what, you know, in the Wiener Stube was a perfect example of what an Aspen restaurant was. The La Casina. I mean, we could name a whole bunch of our friends' restaurants. Now they're owned, you know, I mean, thank God Barclay has something there.
Well, and it's funny that you mentioned Tom's Market, because I worked at Tom's Market all through middle school, high school, and into college. And that was such a community thing for me. That was so important. I was out in front of the middle school, which was the red brick building then, tossing a football, which is hysterical if you know me, because, you know, why would I toss a football? I was with a couple of friends, and we were just playing around, and my good friend Steve Langley had just gotten a job at Tom's Market sacking groceries, and we were laying around, and he tripped over this piece of wire going across the grass and hurt his back. And so I said, oh, well, you know, he was so afraid of losing his job that he just got. I said, well, I'll go in and work for you until you get feeling better. I mean, you know, in what small town, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, and So I did, and of course, I knew the owners anyway. Kurt Barr and anyway. So I went in and covered for him until he was feeling better, and then by the time he came back, they said, "Well, let's keep you here. We want you to keep working." So I started stocking shelves, and I ended up being a meat cutter at Tom's Market. I would get up at 4:30 in the morning, go in, sweep and mop the whole store, and then I would set up the meat counter, and then I would go to school, and then after school I would come down, work for a couple of hours, and then I'd go back out and rehearse for whatever band concert or musical But it was that sense of, everybody had a charge account at Tom's Market, and occasionally I would drive the delivery van, and I always knew where I was going. I knew everybody. It was that sort of hometown fun.
It was Mayberry in the mountains in a way. In a strange way, there was a Mayberry sense, and I felt like Tom's Market was the epitome of that. And the whole idea that people had a monthly account that they would pay at the end of the month, and just go in and get stuff. And I was like, coming from LA, that was insane.
Yeah. Kids would come in and charge, some snacks to their parents' account, and and Bernie Dickerson, who was the manager of the store, and I built a heated cat house. It was a sort of a stray cat that ended up sort of living at Tom's, and so he and I built this little heated cat house outside the cat to live in, and So I don't know that kids have those kind of connections now. Some do, but
what is there because I remember before it wasn't like anyone was forced to have a job. Some kids were, but most kids just had a summer job because it was something to do, and you weren't a trust fund baby, you actually had a job. And so it sort of became a thing. What's that like now? Do kids actually get summer jobs, and are they going out for that stuff, or is it just sort of some do, some don't? And
I think some do. I know my nephews did growing up, so cookie munchers or something.
I know Los Simple's kids do.
I think some people probably do, and some, are off doing, summer camps or whatever. When I was the production manager for Theater Aspen, a lot of the kids would come and work on different jobs at the tent for Theater Aspen for sort of a summer gig, or they would take summer classes with Theater Aspen. And I know that Theater Aspen keeps those kind of classes going. And there are others obviously as well, but as was the case then, there were some kids who would get to go travel all summer, or do these huge adventures elsewhere. But I was listening to a little bit of when you were having a conversation with Brucker, and she was talking about selling the Aspen Times. Yep, did that.
Yeah, we all did.
A bag full of papers, and she mentioned that she would go hang out at the pub. I went to the Elks Club and the Eagles Club.
Yeah.
But you had regulars that you would go and then I would take my money and I would go to the I think it was called the Cheese Company. It was in the Aspen Square building, and I'd go get a hunk of cheese to nibble on, and whatever. My working at Tom's Market was, it started off as just sort of, I was trying to help a friend, but I ended up, because I grew up with a single mom, and, we were not of the wealthy spectrum. So, I ended up bringing groceries home. That's what I did. That's how and then that way I was able to pay for my first car and that sort of thing. So
I just feel like the work experience in my life, and hiring people in a studio setting and having to deal with, of course, the art folks. It's a little different than stage, but it's still sort of the creative folk. That it is so important to have had some kind of work experience and environment. So Coach D with football, that's team, and that's, whatever, and that works. Or Conoroe with basketball, and that's team, and that works and all. But there is something to be said about working at the Gant or working at La Casino, where you have locals and tourists and all these different people from around the world that you have to deal with. And I remember hitting me really hard when I was at the Pelletiers Lodge and little Nicole was making change for people. And I think she was, what, 9? You know, and I was like going, wow, this town really teaches us a lot of different things just where you are. It's not just school, it's getting a job at the Gant. And I felt like that was I began to realize how important that was. And when I start to hire people and I don't see any of those kind of skills that come with doing that, it makes it a little harder for me to work with them. You know what I mean? And I wonder, how do you feel about preparing kids when they're so busy doing everything else, but they don't learn how to interact with real people?
Well, you know, one thing that I'll say that I think it really your comment points to, and that is, not only did we learn a certain, you know, set of skills and maybe work ethic, but we were giving back to and receiving from our community. We were a part of the town. We were a part of something that was greater than just us. And you know, I'm afraid that that's just not something that happens anymore. And you know, I'm teaching at Colorado Mountain College, so I'm seeing a lot of young people, and I got to be honest with you, we're having a hard time preparing people for stepping into a world where they understand that kind of work ethic. The communities around are having a hard time hiring students now, and it's not just from our institution, it's from everywhere, because there's just a different mentality. And I think some of that is probably from the pandemic. Some of that is just generational. Some of that is because we have technology now. I mean, you know, when I was a kid, you know, Mom would say, "What time are you going to be home?" And I'd say, "Oh, I'll be home by such and such time." She said, "Okay, well, you know, if you're going to be later than that, just let me know."
Right.
Well, you know, you can't be out in the middle of the woods doing something stupid and let Mom know that I'm running a little late.
You're right.
You know? I mean, it just wasn't going to happen. And, you know, I mean,
smoke signals, that's about it.
So, you know, I don't know. I just think
it's an interesting dilemma that I see our society having to deal with. You know, we push in so many directions that we don't look at the cause and effect. And I feel like it's interesting because in Aspen, I always use Aspen as a frog, because it's a perfect thing of an ecosystem. When you want to go see how an ecosystem is doing, go look at the frog. And so I use Aspen as a frog because the change that's happening in Aspen, it's happening here in Portland too. It's different. It's a much bigger city, so it's not quite as drastic, but everything that's happening in Aspen is happening here. You know, okay, so we're not getting, you know, now you're in 6th homeowners as opposed to 2nd or 3rd homeowners. But in Portland, we're getting everybody moving up from San Francisco. So if they had a company that did any kind of business and they just don't want to be in San Francisco anymore, they move up to Portland. So we're getting a whole influx of a whole bunch of new people who are bringing their life up here, as opposed to when I came to Aspen in the 70s, people left all that. They were done with Dallas, they were done with LA, they were done with New York. They just gave it up and they said, okay, what do I do? And they just joined in with Aspen. They had a Blazer or a Subaru or a Jeep. They wore jeans, and you couldn't tell the difference between Stranahan or my dad, you know? And it was, you know, and I feel like now that's very different. You got people that have all there's a whole game being played, as opposed to back in Aspen where everybody was just, let's just get away from all that. Let's just disappear here. And so there's a shift going on in the population that lives there now. You know what I mean? And that's what's happening here in Portland too. So I feel like
everybody can point to one place, but it's everywhere.
you know? And that's why I feel like using a place like Aspen can help people see their own. You know what I mean? In other words, I feel like it becomes Aspen can be a petri dish for the rest of the world if we open it up. You know, that's kind of what the Pepkes wanted. They wanted the world to come out and come to this place, hide away, and talk about all the things that we need to fix and change. That's kind of what the Aspen Institute was when it started out, you know, and even the design conference. And now it's kind of different. The Ideas Fest, it's like you got to have $5,000, you got to be able to stay, you got to do this and that. It's a totally different deal. Thanks for listening. The authors of Growing Up Aspen would like to thank you and would like to also thank the Aspen Times and the Aspen Daily News for giving us materials for our book, Growing Up Aspen, Adventures of the Unsupervised, which you can get at twistandturnpress.com and any local bookstore. Thanks.